Hey everyone, this is Pete, and I'm a bit of a lapsed Trekker. As a teen, I used to watch Star Trek The Next Generation pretty religiously during what once seemed like its perpetual reruns on BBC Two on a Wednesday evening. I must confess I never have gotten around to seeing how Deep Space Nine and Voyager ended, and anything beyond that is a bit of a mystery to me. With that in mind, I had a certain degree of trepidation when a friend told me there was a new-ish, Star Trek came out. Would I be too far behind in the overall franchise lore to appreciate it? Or would it be just a thing to remind me why I used to love Star Trek so much? Apparently, it's been available on PC for a while, but no one noticed because it was initially an Epic Games Store exclusive, and I've not stumbled across any coverage of it or indeed anyone talking about it. This is a shame, because it's good. And don't worry PC owners, a Steam release is planned for those of you who get precious about digital storefronts. It didn't take long for my mind to be set at rest regarding my lapsed Trekker status, because Star Trek Resurgence is set aboard a Federation vessel that is original to the game, the USS Resolute. It's set sometime after the conclusion of Star Trek The Next Generation, but eventually reveals itself to be a sequel to a first season episode, specifically the 5th episode, known as The Last Outpost, during which the crew of the Enterprise D encounter the last remnants of an ancient civilization known as the Takon. I won't go into any further depth on that side of things for the moment, because the initial setup for the game is all original, introducing main characters Commander Jana Rydek, new First Officer of the USS Resolute, and Petty Officer Carter Diaz, a new addition to the Resolute's engineering crew. As the game progresses, the action switches back and forth between the two to provide different perspectives on the unfolding narrative. It's a good pair of characters to do this with, as between them they represent both the upper and lower ends of the Federation chain of command, allowing us to experience both the weighty decisions of leadership and the sometimes tricky, often thankless task of putting those orders into workable practice. Star Trek Resurgence immediately establishes its tone as inclusive, in keeping with the philosophy behind the earlier series in the franchise. Commander Rydek is introduced as being part Kobliad, a species that put in occasional appearances in Star Trek The Next Generation and Deep Space Nine, and one that is dependent on the scarce resource known as Duridium in order to ensure their cellular structure maintains its integrity. At the time of Star Trek Resurgence, Commander Rydek is one of the last remaining members of her people, as Duridium has become increasingly hard to find. The allegory here is fairly obvious, but sensitively handled. Commander Rydek is someone who is living with a debilitating and potentially fatal chronic condition, but is managing to make the best of her life despite this. Indeed, being promoted to First Officer of the Resolute shows that she's thriving, and certainly not allowing her condition to either hold her back or define her. Commander Rydek's circumstances aren't just there to make an allegorical point about inclusivity, mind you. As one of the few surviving members of a near-extinct species, she is in the unique position to be able to empathise with other cultures that are in a similar situation. This is of relevance at numerous points in the narrative, with characters often drawing attention to her heritage as a means of emotional manipulation. It's up to you as to whether or not she gives in. Diaz, meanwhile, is a down-to-earth sort of guy who is shown to have some pre-existing relationships with members of the Resolute's crew. Most notably, his engineering compatriot Neely Edsela, who is an unjoined trill with strong opinions about this whole symbiont thing, and security officer Miranda Maris, who almost immediately establishes herself as a love interest, though you are free to turn her down if you see fit to do so. As with Rydek, you're given a touch of flexibility in how you play Diaz and manage his relationships with not only the somewhat hot-headed Neely and the seemingly gentle Miranda, but also his superior officer Chovak, the Vulcan head of engineering on the Resolute. In contrast to the relatively gentle landing Diaz gets, Commander Rydek is immediately thrown into a difficult situation. She is replacing the first officer on the Resolute because of an accident that seemingly came about as a result of the ship's captain running dangerous experiments in an attempt to make a name for himself. At the time Rydek boards the Resolute, many of the surviving crew view her with a certain amount of mistrust, since the previous first officer, a victim of said accident, was, it seems, well loved. That mistrust is something which can be overcome, but Rydek has to work at it. Her position is made even more precarious by the aforementioned captain being a personal friend, but also a man who is clearly on the brink of being overwhelmed by stress and the unreasonable expectations he's set for himself. Rydek needs to tread carefully in her relationship with him, though again there are plenty of opportunities to play her in different ways, with varying degrees of consequence according to what ends up transpiring. Since Star Trek Resurgence is primarily story, I should probably stop saying too much about the narrative at this point. The game's reason for being is to tell its story, nothing more, nothing less. That means if you come into this hoping for an in-depth simulation of serving aboard a Federation science vessel, you'll leave disappointed. But you can at least take solace from the fact that there are other games out there that will fit your needs much better, both within the Star Trek franchise and in the broader sci-fi game space. I recommend Starflight and Star Control 2 for starters. If, on the other hand, you've been longing for years to play a game that is essentially an interactive Star Trek TV episode, you're going to have an absolute blast with this, and for quite different reasons to earlier narrative-centric Trek games such as Star Trek The Next Generation: The Final Unity and Star Trek 25th Anniversary, both of which adopted a fairly traditional point-and-click adventure approach. Star Trek Resurgence's developer Dramatic Labs is formed of ex-Telltale staff, and it shows, since Star Trek Resurgence is essentially a Telltale game, following a similar formula to their episodic Walking Dead game from 2012. This isn't an episodic release, however, that's a trend we appear to have left well and truly behind at this point to my great relief, but rather one feature-length story that is split into smaller named chapters along the way. In a nice touch, each new chapter is introduced with on-screen titles that look and feel very much like those seen in the TV show, though some of those chapters are just a little bit too short to be an entirely convincing recreation of the TV format. For much of Star Trek Resurgence, there's no real delineation between cutscene and gameplay, because even during cinematic sequences you may be called upon to perform button and stick inputs, sometimes with tight time constraints. You'll also be presented with dialogue options for Rydek and Diaz, many of which affect the interpersonal relationships between the protagonists and their crewmates. Rather strangely, the game's interface appears to suggest that these decisions are timed, but upon allowing the timer to expire, all that happens is the action pauses with seemingly no consequences. Making a decision beforehand, meanwhile, causes Rydek or Diaz to either say their piece at an appropriate break in the conversation, or if tensions are running high during that particular scene, to interrupt whoever is speaking. In fact, it's the parts where Star Trek Resurgence puts up a pretense of having traditional gameplay that it's at its weakest. There are sections where you get to take direct control of both Rydek and Diaz, but more often than not they're little more than walking towards the next cutscene, or occasionally finding a hidden trigger point or two somewhere in an environment. You certainly can't go freely wandering around the Resolute or any of the various alien environments, and to be fair, there's no reason for you to do so. The game doesn't have any collectibles or hidden items to artificially pad out its playtime, so there's no reason for it to hold up the narrative by allowing you to wander around poking your head into places that aren't relevant. The action sequences present a slightly more serious issue, with probably the weakest parts of the game being the few cover shooter scenarios. In these, you're generally tasked with sitting in a static location protecting a character or vehicle from incoming enemy fire, but all they boil down to is looking for the enemies with the markers over their heads and dispatching them as a priority. You rarely even need to defeat all the enemies to progress. Things are made a tad more difficult by the rather clunky controls, which inexplicably auto-center when you're in cover rather than allowing you to properly line up a shot before popping up, but they're not insurmountable by any means. And if you do find yourself struggling, after any failure, you can opt to play the sequence in story mode, which essentially makes you and your allies invincible. The situation is similar with the game's stealth sequences, which are mercifully few in number and very simple when they do crop up. While I appreciate that Dramatic Labs probably wanted to include some sequences that made Star Trek Resurgence feel more like a video game and less of an interactive movie, honestly they could have simply had these sections as cutscenes, perhaps interspersed with a QuickTime event or two, and the game would have been just as strong, if not stronger. Interactive movie isn't a forbidden phrase today in the same way that it was in the 1990s. Modern day players, or at least a specific niche thereof, are much more familiar and comfortable with the concept of a narrative-centric experience such as a visual novel or full-motion video game than ever before. Because the standard of presentation, and in particular the quality of acting, has improved considerably since the first attempts to make interactive movies at the dawn of the CD-ROM era, it's now a viable option to make a game that is, for the most part, a predefined story being delivered. Sure, this style of game will always have its critics who think that every game should give the player full immersive control at all times, and that movie-style storytelling should stick to, well, movies. But the fact remains, it is absolutely a viable creative choice for a developer to make today, and Star Trek Resurgence is at its absolute most compelling and enjoyable when it's being an interactive movie, not when it's pretending to be a third-person action adventure. This isn't to say all the gameplay sequences are bad though, and I hasten to add even the examples I've just cited aren't irredeemably awful enough to ruin the experience of playing Star Trek Resurgence. The scenes where you get to fly a shuttlecraft through a rather perilous environment are a lot of fun, and the puzzle-esque scenarios in which you get to scan areas with a tricorder or interact directly with computer consoles are satisfying and enjoyable to engage with, even if their solutions are always very straightforward. For the most part, Star Trek Resurgence feels like a game that wants you to experience and enjoy the story it has to tell, which is why it's so jarring when you get a hard game over for failing an action sequence. This holds up the narrative progression until you overcome the obstacle. During the story-centric parts of the game, meanwhile, the decisions you make simply inform how the plot continues to unfold and can have quite a significant impact on both the core cast of characters and how later encounters proceed. But there are no wrong answers that will immediately cause your mission to fail and demand that you restart from the last checkpoint. While it would have doubtless been a nightmare to plan the story with the risk of one of the protagonists being captured or killed during an action sequence, I feel like there are probably more elegant ways things could have been handled in this regard. But, well, this is what we've got, and it's not hard to live with. Presentation-wise, the game is, well, serviceable is probably a polite way to put it. The game runs on Unreal Engine 4, and while it does a decent job for the most part, there are occasional graphical hiccups here and there, and some fast-paced action sequences in the latter part of the game demonstrate how this is not an engine you want to be using if you need quick, snappy scene changes, because it struggles to keep up at times. The game is obviously put together on a relatively limited budget, and it does its best. Just don't come into it expecting photorealism. Looking at it from another perspective, however, a touch of jank is very authentically Star Trek, so if you have previous experience with the earlier series and the franchise in particular, you'll probably be willing to forgive Star Trek Resurgence its few quirks. And the space scenes do at least look very good, with plenty of the vibrant, colourful stellar backgrounds often seen in the shows, as opposed to a simple flat black starfield. While the character models are a little variable in quality, one thing the game does do very well is facial animation, particularly with regard to expressions and lip syncing. A lot is added to the narrative simply through the way the various characters visibly react to the situations in which they find themselves, sometimes quite subtly, and the characters' mouth movements match the words they're saying in a notably convincing manner. This brings us to what is probably the absolute strongest aspect of the game, its stellar voice acting, no pun intended. It should probably be said that the big-name guest star Jonathan Frakes only has a rather underwhelming brief appearance as Captain Riker in a couple of scenes, with his role as the central character of Star Trek Resurgence's predecessor in the first season of Next Generation, the only real justification for him being there at all. But the main cast do an amazing job of bringing their characters to life for the rest of the game. The core ensemble quickly establishes itself as just as strong and diverse as any seen in the various Star Trek TV shows, and the fact that there's near constant tension between Rydek and most of her bridge crew certainly adds an interesting twist to things in a similar fashion to the early episodes of Deep Space Nine and Voyager. Of particular note is Piotr Michael's incredible performance as Ambassador Spock. Michael's background is in, among other things, celebrity impersonations, and he does such a good Spock in Star Trek Resurgence that I actually had to double check whether or not my memory of Leonard Nimoy's passing in 2015 was real or not.
There have been civilizations and entities, both past and present, far more technologically advanced than the Federation.
The Illydians and Hotari don't fall into that category.
But that is all the more reason to investigate further.
It was, sadly, but it is at least reassuring to know that Spock remains in good hands, at least so far as voice acting is concerned. Plus the fact that Michael is doubtless a lot more reasonably priced than Nimoy was in his prime means that we actually get a substantial amount of Spock over the course of Star Trek Resurgence's narrative, making his contribution feel a lot more worthwhile than that of Frakes as Riker. To summarise then, so long as you go into Star Trek Resurgence with the appropriate expectations, that the game is a narrative-centric experience first and foremost, and that it was likely put together with quite a bit less of a budget than a name as big as Star Trek probably deserves, you'll have a great time. I found it hard to put down while I was engaged with its narrative, I felt that it was a good length, providing sufficient depth for its characters and plot threads without wearing out its welcome. Plus there's always the option of replaying and doing things a bit differently to see what happens. I'd definitely be up for seeing another game following the adventures of the Resolute and her crew at some point in the future, though without spoiling things that would probably present some significant challenges for the writing team based on the various ways certain events can unfold in the late game. Perhaps it's better to simply say that Dramatic Labs have made a cracking interactive Star Trek movie here, and I sincerely hope they have the opportunity to do more. And so, it just remains for me to say, as always, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you again next time.